Hey, hello everyone. My name is Eric Masowski, and in this tutorial we're going to be continuing the organic modeling series by finishing up the texture coordinates for the head. So if we drop down into the Unwrap UVW modifier from our modifier panel, click on Edit underneath Parameters, and just take a quick look at how the UVs were laid out. You can see around the eye, nothing really surprising there. Around the nostril, just nicely spaced out. Same with the mouth and parts of the neck and chin. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to actually treat the ear. So to treat the ear, we go through the same process as before. Now before we get into selecting the faces, we're just going to turn off the checker pattern. So if we press M on the keyboard and then click on the blue and white checkered box for our material. Here we go. Press L to get into the left mode. Make sure we have paint selection. We're in face subobject mode. And then just click and drag over the various parts. You can hold down Alt on the keyboard to remove from the selection. And do a quick rotate around. Make sure you got them all. There we go. Okay, so now that we have this selection, we want to move our way down to our map parameters. Now with the rest of the head, we just applied a cylindrical mapping. Now most of these projection methods aren't going to work very well because there's a lot of overlapping detail here. However, what we want to do is we want to give pelt mapping kind of like a reference point. So a way to flatten it out, like which direction is the dominant direction here. So in our case, it's the left view. So we click on planar. It's already facing the left view. And we'll just click on fit so it's nice and snug around our selection. We're now going to move over to pelt. And the way that pelt mapping works is it pretty much pulls your surface and stretches it out. So what it's going to do is it's going to latch onto each of these edge vertices along the seam and pull them out away from the center, and as a result flattening out the rest of the shape. So what we need to do is we actually need to define a couple break points or break seams where it can separate the mesh, because if we just pull this out as it is or stretch this out, there are parts of this that won't get completely flattened. So we do this through seams down at the bottom here. We can either do edit seams by singly clicking on any particular edge. Same selection rules apply, Control and Alt. Control adds, Alt removes. Or we have a point-to-point seam. If we click on one point, drag the cursor to the next point, and click, it will trace a line from one to the next. And that's actually, I wanted to go down here. There we go. So there we go. We now have a nice seam where it can split apart a little bit. Okay, so now that we have this, we're going to click on Edit Pelt Map down at the very bottom. Now this brings up a dialog box that's virtually identical to the Edit UVs dialog box. The only difference is that we're currently in pelt editing mode. So if we go and we click on the individual UV coordinates here, it won't have any effect on our resulting mesh. All we want to do is we just want to modify this outer ring. And this outer ring is called the stretcher. So if we click on our scale tool, give us some space, we also want to rotate the stretcher so that it's pulling the various parts in the right direction. So you can see it's going to take this point and pull it all the way up there. That one over to the sides, and so on. If you want it to not be in a circular shape, you can easily just scale it in a particular direction basically just gain whatever shape you want. Here we're going to scale it up a little bit more. And then on the right hand side we're just going to use the defaults here and simulate the pulling. And you notice what happened right away. Let's do a quick undo. You simulate. It just pulled them out. It did a great job of just starting to flatten this. And if we zoom in a little bit closer, you can see we still have some overlapping parts. So we can pull again. Still a few. There we go. We can also try to relax a little bit. Pull again. Relax a little bit. Pull again. Pull again. There we go. Alright, so there we have a nice flattened shape. Now that we're done, we just close this down, and those texture coordinates are now assigned to our face selection. So if we bring back our material and zoom in, we have a pretty decent coverage. There are still some areas that we need to fix, which we probably could have if we spent a little bit more time with the relax tools, but we're just going to modify these by hand. So we're going to go back up to parameters, click on edit, we're going to filter our selected faces, go over to our freeform mode, scale this down dramatically because it's way too big, especially in relation to the rest of the head. And now let's take a close look at what we have here. We've got the head, and then we've got the ear over here to the side. Now ideally, we would like to fit the ear into this spot. However, if we're just going to be using a 3D painting tool, we could easily place this ear somewhere else, like down here. Now before we try to fit it into its final place, let's just go ahead and clean up the results a little bit. You can see that there are some spots, especially right in here, that need to be spaced out a little bit. So let's jump ahead to where that's done. Okay, so it's looking a bit better. Now one thing that you want to avoid when creating your UV layout is you want to avoid these kind of ambiguous quads. So you want to make your quads flow much like they do with your actual geometry. Okay, so now that we have this basically done, we're now going to look at how we can fit this into our head here. So if we click and drag over the entire set, just move it over a little bit. Now you'll notice that as I click on the various vertices, we get blue ones highlighted on the side there. Now each one of these blue things, it corresponds to a different vertex. So you can see down here, this vertex is matched up with that one as well as that one. Now it doesn't look like we're going to be able to fit this perfectly into the space, because if we welded or brought this vertex with this vertex and that one close together, we're going to reintroduce overlap. So because of that, we're just going to take this and we can just generally fit it into the cavity that we created. So let's jump ahead to where we have that fitted. Okay, so we have it in place, but we're noticing that it's actually quite small. We look at over to the right into our viewport and we see that we just don't have a lot of detail there. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually just move it over here to the corner, and we'll just have to pay special attention to the seams when we're painting our texture. So let's turn on select element and drag it down to our corner. Deactivate select element, and let's move some of these faces around to give us a little bit more room. And turn select element back on, and let's scale it up just a little bit. Okay, so there we go. We have the ear in place, all unwrapped, and we have the head basically done. So now what we're going to do is we're going to first test this out to make sure that we don't have any overlapping parts or any inverted and so on. So let's move over to face mode, click an empty space to deselect, and go up to select and do inverted. Now we have one inverted face here. So if we zoom in close, you can see that this is because of those ambiguous quads. So if we just make this a little bit clearer on how the quad is actually formed, jump back to polygon mode and then do select inverted, you can see it's no longer inverted. Okay, so now we want to go up to select and do overlapping faces. Now, overlapping faces often result in a crash with ZBrush, especially when generating the displacement maps. So it's definitely something you want to avoid if you plan on taking this to that package. Okay, so there we go. So we zoom out again, switch over to face, select overlapping faces, nothing. Okay, so we're good to move on. Okay, so let's close this down, get out of face mode, jump back, and then go to symmetry. Now you'll notice that it's the same on both sides. Okay, it's actually identical. If we now apply an unwrap UVW on top of our symmetry modifier, we can modify both parts of it. Now this sometimes gets a little bit tricky or a little cumbersome, but if we switch over to face mode, choose select element, and then click on our head here. Now we want to make sure we get the mirrored side. Sometimes you may not get it right away, so you're going to have to keep on trying. Once we have it, just click on mirror and drag it off to the side, matching up the seam right down the middle. Okay, now that we have that, let's zoom in close to this seam. Okay, so we didn't bring it in close enough, and we brought it down a little bit. So we just want to make sure that we line it up as best we can. Alright, now we switch over to vertex mode. What we're going to do is we're going to weld this seam going all the way down so it's a nice, consistent texture, mapping layout. Because right now if we click and drag on any one of these points, you can tell that they're separate. So if we click and drag over both of them and press Control W on our keyboard, Control W, you can see that it makes a white line. And that means that it's now one texture coordinate. So we can try to do multiples at once. However, you notice that it ended up welding two that we didn't want right here on the chin. So we can fix this in two ways. The first is to just go in and select the offending ones and handle them one by one. Or what we can do is underneath options for our Edit UVWs dialog box, we can decrease or increase our weld threshold. Now typically I just like going in and adjusting it myself, just handling each one independently and then moving on from there, because this weld threshold is a really nice value for a lot of work. So see, it just handled all of those without any problem. So use whichever one you feel comfortable with. And now let's jump ahead to where this entire seam is welded. Okay, there we go. We now have a nice white line going all the way down the middle, and I stopped welding right when they started to branch off to their respective sides. Now that we have this all done, we're going to go over to Select Element, click on our ear, and we want to make sure that we get the right one again. Let's try with face mode. There we go. And we're going to drag this over to the side, mirror it. Okay, so now that we have pretty much all our UVs done, we're going to set it up into the format that we want. Now you can either go into a perfectly square texture, or in the case of heads, I usually like to go 2 by 1. So underneath options, you do 512 by 256. Now this doesn't have to be your final resolution. This is just kind of like the aspect ratio. Okay, so now that we have all of this set and we have a general idea of our texture size, we now want to resize this so it fits within this box. So if we go over to freeform mode, click and drag on the top right corner, and then just bring it in. You want to make sure that you have a little bit of buffer around your object. Okay, so there we go. There's our UV layout. Now we want to turn this into an image so that we can take it into Photoshop and use it as a guide. So to do this, we just go up to Tools, Render UVW Template. At the top, we specify our resolution. Since we have a 2 by 1 aspect ratio, we can either tell it to guess the aspect ratio, which we want to try to keep at powers of 2. So we're going to actually go with a width of 2048 by 1024. And then we'll just use the defaults. Click Render, zoom in, and you can see that we have everything represented here. Now you'll also notice that it drew the seams in here as well. If we close this down and just turn off seam edges, we get a nice, clean, white guide here. We can then bring this into Photoshop, use it as a mask, or this actually has a mask or alpha channel already set up for it. Now a couple other options with this which are pretty useful is the fill mode. We can tell it to fill it with a solid color, normal information, or the shaded information. So for example, let's turn off our visible edges, switch over to normal, and click Render UV Template. You can see how it puts in the normal information here. This could be used as a starting point for our texture. You'll also notice that it has Show Overlap in red, and we have a couple overlapping polygons that we missed. So we're going to go in and fix those. So let's see where they are. Select, overlapping, kind of hard to say. Let's take another look. And so you can use this as a guide to figure out if you missed anything and need to go back and fix it. Another option is shaded. And what this will do is it will kind of like render out your image, or render out your surface based on your UV coordinates. So you can do some really great stuff like with global illumination or ambient occlusion and so on. Okay, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me or post on the forums. Thank you.